Please offer POIs in the chat. Almost 75% of charitable giving in the United States today goes to religious organizations. This is food, water, and shelter for the poor that would otherwise disappear in Prop's world. And we are very proud to say that the most important thing in the round is just helping as many poor people as possible. I'm going to be talking about three things in this speech. Firstly, about why internally within religions, framing this as an obligation is necessary to incentivize large numbers of people to give. Secondly, why we get more money under our side of the house and the secular alternative is insufficient for that. And then finally, why religious charities do uniquely important work. On to the first thing over why this is necessary within religious organizations internally. So I agree with Ahmed that like hardcore zealots might still give under either side of the house, but I think that for the average person within religion, framing this as an obligation is something that is absolutely necessary. Firstly, there are some people within religions who are only going to do something if it is going to please God, rather than just something that like might allow me to access slightly more goody two-shoes points. When you frame it as an obligation to a much larger extent, I think it increases the individual burden on action in order to encourage them to avoid doing an actively bad thing that I think is effectively conceded in the proposition framing. I think that the second thing to say here is that framing this as being an obligation has created a strong social culture within religious systems overall in favor of the norm of giving and charitable donations being something that ought to be put on a pedestal and is something that is uniquely important. So in the context of religion, we needed this as an obligation in order to access all of the benefits of economies of scale. The second claim then that I want to forward is why we get way more money and why the secular alternative is like insufficient in terms of actually helping the number of people who we care about under our side of the house. I think that there are four reasons why we get a lot more money. The first thing to say is that donations are a lot less sporadic when it comes to religious context. I think that secular giving is often something that happens on a one-off basis. So I'm walking on the street and I see a billboard of like a starving child, and then I'm donated to like go to their page and then to give like $20 to them. On the comparative though, religious giving is unique and that is something that is substantially more consistent. So programs like Zakat often mandate a continual giving of income, often on like a monthly or bi-monthly basis, and that individual people are not just donating one-off basis of empathy spurts, rather there's a more consistent flow of money that are going to organizations. The second thing to say though, and that's similar to the mechanism presented in the first argument, there are certain individuals who lack large degrees of empathy and therefore need a religious obligation. Ahmed just asserts empathy like exists for a lot of people, but I think that it doesn't for a lot of reasons, right? Firstly, I just think that empathy exists on a spectrum and some people are just born with like less of it. Look at all the people in COVID who did not give a crap about going outside, wearing masks, did not contribute to like community support systems. But secondly, even for those who do feel empathy, it's often centralized on the basis of the familiarity. How easily am I able to put myself in someone else's shoes? As an upper middle class individual, you might just think that the poor are like lazy, that they're not working hard enough, and it's unclear that you're going to give to them rather than just give to other Karens on your Facebook page who are posting GoFundMe pages. The third thing to say though is that awareness of religious charities for religious people is often something that is uniquely higher. So there's often just like a large number of secular charities that can be quite overwhelming for a lot of people. You're often bombarded with a lot of information, which is often different from like the church. You can often have instructions over the kind of places where you can and you ought donate to, which I think helps overcome just like the myriad of other charities that exist and just centralize funding in a single location as well. Why does all of this matter? I think that insofar as secular charities empirically exist under the status quo alongside religious charities, that just easily proves that we get a lot more money being given to charity under our side of the house. What this world looks like are more homeless people having access to shelters, more poor people having access to things like food and clean water. Why is helping people the most important metric of the round? Firstly, even if you think that this is oppressive toward the poor within religious organizations, which I want to note as framed in a closing POI, it is often not. Zakat is literally only something that is mandated for those who are above a particular income stream. There's often sliding scales over obligations to donate. Just because people do not consent to be born into religion, the poor did not consent to be poor, in which case I think that they're also being instrumentalized in a sense under the status quo where their basic rights are not being facilitated, and therefore helping the most of them, given that some middle class people within religion are the ones who are donating a lot, is the most important. I also want to weigh helping the poor against certain like best case scenario gov arguments. So firstly, they're like people feel better about themselves and it's not framed as being like an obligation. That is less important than a starving person having access to food. But I also don't think that framing as an obligation means that you're unable to extract joy from it. Every time you donate, you're telling yourself, I'm a good religious person. I'm following my pathway into heaven. I am pleasing God. The second gov argument that I want to weigh this against is like the religion uses as a tool for manipulation. Panel, indulgences would have existed historically under either side of the house and the church would have capitalized themselves. This is money that is going to charity. It is not money that is going to funding the church. Finally here, even if you think that secularism is something that is like better and a gov team is able to be like religious charities bad, these do not play a conflicting role with one another, but rather religious and secular charities have a complementary function under the status quo. There are three structural reasons for this. The first is that religious charities are often those that are regionally based, so secular charities are actually able to spread their resources less thin when they're able to go into areas that religious charities are not operating in. Secondly, though, they often focus on different areas of charity. So secular charities are often about let's save the pandas and let's save the cute animals, environmental movements, drunk driving, but overall, religious charities have hugely tapped into the niche of like helping people who are impoverished. Finally, it's possible for these charities to operate simultaneously within the same area in like a productive way. There's been certain cooperation between religious and secular charities, building schools within the developing world, because both charities often genuinely do care about helping the poor and do not want to undercut one another within these regions. Before I continue, closing government.
See, so when you say when people donate, they like feeling they're good religious people. Presumably those incentives still exist on your side in the sense that people like feeling like they are good religious people, especially given the community culture of
Yeah,
religion.
so perhaps some people are going to do that in order to go like above and beyond, but I think that you have to concede that there are some people where maybe doing slightly better things to please God is not going to be a sufficient enough motivator. But the threat of not being able to get into heaven because I'm not giving scares substantially more people to be able to like donate as well. I think that further framing it as an obligation allows you to get things like mandating people give money on a certain monthly basis. So all of the mechanization that I've given would not otherwise exist. We get more money. Finally, why do religious charities do a lot of uniquely good work that ultimately exists? In terms of bad norms, like not giving people condoms, insofar as like Gov is saying religious charities exist anyways, and the church is broadly like anti-gay people and anti-condoms and anti like sex protection anyways. That is a symmetric thing. Two good things end up happening with religious charities. Firstly, more countries let them in. There are a lot of religious governments who otherwise have an aversion to let them in, which they just can't do, right? You can either just kick them out or have a lot of regulatory interference, which changes when firstly, like you're not challenging the underlying religious legitimacy of governments by saying that religion is not ultimately superior. But I think a lot of governments also fear like a direct challenge to authority when secular charities are going to come in and proselytize against the regime and proselytize secularism. This is why in countries like Bhutan, only religious charities are allowed in, helping a lot of poor get access to resources. Secondly, though, buy-in to these charities amongst religious people is substantially higher. Some moderate religious people might use secular services under either side of the house, but some individuals won't. Getting things from charities is often stigmatized, and you often need your own religious services to like tell you that is something that is okay. There's no longer a fear that like a secular agenda is going to try and change you when you actually know that these are people who are like me, meaning that more people get access to resources. For all these reasons, very proud to stand in opening opposition.
All right, we thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. We now welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to proceed and conclude the opening half of this debate. Here.
Great. Can I confirm I'm clearly audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Two things in this speech. First, I will comprehensively refute the OG case and explain why they cannot win the debate in any world. Then I will explain the rest of the opposition arguments on the debate and burn the rest of the extensions. On the CGPOI, unfortunately for Enting, Ahmed conceded, and they have to stand behind this on CG, that in the absence of obligation, only hardcore zealots or much fewer people donate, which means there is indeed far less money going to charity on either side of the house, even with the psychological mechanisms that Ahmed says still exist. But even if the compulsion to donate exists on either side, this debate is then one for us on the margins, right? Because for many people, there's a cost-benefit analysis in terms of a trade-off. In the absence of the threat to an immortal soul getting in trouble, we think other people who have the means are more likely to weigh their approximate needs, i.e. buying their son a second coat over donating to the poor. It's a question of on the margins, whether you buy a second coat for your son as a devout Catholic instead of giving stuff to the poor. We say that insofar as you maximize agency for the impoverished people significantly more, because in the absence of that giving, they likely die or they suffer severe harm. We think it's far more justified. On OG, I have 5 responses to their case. First, framing on the concessions they made. OG concedes there's going to be a lot more money historically when they literally use it to explain consolidating the power of the church to a much larger extent. They need to pick one. Either Kira is right and almost the same amount of money gets donated, in which case we win on the marginal benefits to the poor and they get no deconsolidation benefit, or she's wrong and we get way more money donated, in which case we win even larger on mass impacts of scale. Secondly, I have an obligation on versus saying that giving to charity is nice. What this does is it causes people to give who otherwise feel like they are fulfilling their religious duties. I think a good example of this is in religions like Buddhism that emphasize a karmic balance to a large extent. So people who feel like they're good Buddhists in all other areas might not give on their side of the house because they feel like they're fulfilling their other religious obligations anyway. When you feel like you need to do this in order to fulfill religious obligations, or you go to hell, or you are unable to attain nirvana, a higher number of people care about it being an obligation of fulfillment being the best. This is the tipping point in terms of getting more people to buy in. This is why we get more donations on our side of the house, which is a comparative win, even if Kira mitigates it. Thirdly, this created an institutionalization of religious giving via programs. This is the analysis that Naomi gives you when she analyzes in retrospect why it is the case that the existence and development of these programs are linked to it being an obligation that you donate towards consistently, which is linked to everything that was said about the Zakat system being created, the ability to donate to charity at scale, the ability for NGOs and so on to plan consistently because the donations come in more consistently. All of these things exist at a massive scale on our side of the house. At the very least, this is a comparative win. On their counterfactual, this is the third response. This is very silly. Without an obligation, they have to concede there's less giving. They say there will be a lot of almsgiving or charity in either world. This is unclear insofar as people have other proximate or overwhelming needs, and it's still less consistent, even if it still happens. I think we're winning on that consistency. Then they say hardcore zealots still donate. Note that hardcore zealots are a minority of the population, which means there's just less money going to charity and fewer poor people benefit on their side of the house. Then they say, you feel bad about yourself, but you don't feel better about yourself because doing extra credit might give you a small dopamine hit, but this is not the same as fulfilling an obligation. This is important because love and a relationship with God is conceptually built around obligation. Performing these kinds of obligatory acts brings you significantly closer to God. You probably feel better on our side of the house. DPM adds a mechanism, and this is important. This is the 5th response as to how other people can give to secular organizations. 1, these are different sets of people. Presumably other people who still can give through secular means can give on either side of the house. There's no analysis as to why the existence of religious charities trades off against secular giving. Naomi's argument about how these groups target different kinds of people still applies here, but rich people give to religious organizations, then they say, and this it symmetrizes our case. This is not comparative. If that's true, they give in either world, we just get more money because we get more believers to buy in on our side, but at best they prove a mitigatory benefit that charity still exists. But even if you think it's only somewhat less money, this is still a comparative win for us because we're still getting more people to buy in and donate. The final response I want to give to opening government is that Ahmed says there will be still coercive pressures that encourage people to donate. The problem with all of his mechanisms about social pressure, like social narratives about the need to give, religious institutions leading by example, just means that this pressure still exists on either side of the house, because when a zealot is still giving a lot of money, you're still going to feel bad as the religious person who's giving less in the community. This means there's not a large delta in terms of how bad you feel comparatively, but our delta, which is much less giving, is significantly larger. The final way I want to give on this is at best their case proves that there's more pressure on people to donate, and this might deprive a middle-class child of a coat. I think a starving person getting access to food matters more because the margin of utility is larger, but it also matters more on the principled level insofar as you're maximizing agency for more people, and poor people are significantly more instrumentalized than the individual who is a middle-class individual who still has agency to access their conception of the good life to a greater extent. OG is out. Before I explain why and preempt the remainder of the extensions in this debate, I'd like to take CG.
Tithing as a practice has been happening for centuries. The reason why poverty is still endemic in many areas is because it continuously reinforces inequalities and only acts as
No, because inequality gets significantly worse on your side of the house at the point at which other states that are religious shut out secular organizations that don't let them in your world. Even if it is the case that religious organizations aren't perfect, what you need to do in this debate is comprehensively disprove why your counterfactual is one in which poverty is eradicated. Otherwise, we get a comparative win of more donations and we're still beating you. Now, why in retrospect is our world one where we get more money going to the poor in larger quantities faster? I think this is important as well. Like, I just think it's unlikely that secularly motivated donations to charity would have filled the void, right? Insofar as people have other proximate overwhelming needs in the absence of that belief, that has an impact on their mortal soul. We think they're more likely to default toward fulfilling those. Secular institutions were significantly less powerful for a long period of time. There's less faith in institutions, less stability, because kingdoms would get overthrown regularly through wars and things like this. But multiple kingdoms or states bought into the idea of God, so there was just more buy into these kinds of things. Even when secular giving happens, as Naomi Wade, it happens less often. It's one-off donations as opposed to a practice of giving. I also don't think religious charities are as powerful without this mechanism, right? Without the consistency of giving mechanism Naomi explained, they just get less resources, which means they outcompete and have less reach, but they're also less able to distribute money via the Zakat networks that exist on our side of the house, which necessitates you develop relationships that insofar as you want to give to different religious charities and have ties with these organizations and get the distribution networks that are necessary for these organizations to gain reach. So even if religious and secular charities exist on either side, they're significantly less powerful in a world without these practices because less consistency of giving and secular alternatives don't fill in social gaps. What is the comparative in our world? In our world, we get vastly more economic impacts. Note historically in Islam, Zakat was used to create a social safety net for the most vulnerable, i.e. widowed women who lost their husbands during the expansion of the caliphate. We think this did a tremendous amount of social good. This goes away on their side. This would have never happened. We think women and children are vastly worse off in a version of Islam that doesn't have Zakat. But secondly, the consistency of the donation allows for charities to better plan for social impact of their spending, because when it happens regularly, you're uniquely able to plan out missions for longer periods of time. It's easier to have a stable budget as a charitable organization when you know you're getting this consistent income source, which allows you better take advantage of economies of scale and donate to more people. What are the impacts on the individual? These kinds of donations are uniquely meaningful. They make you feel good about yourself. Insofar as consent is a metric you want to weigh in this debate, we think this is secondary to accessing one's conception of happiness. The reason we value agency is because it allows people as a prerequisite to attain the good life. On our side of the house, we attain the good better by having a good relationship with God, which means we are logically prior to arguments about agency in this debate. But why is our world a counterfactual one in which religious or charities did significantly less good? Naomi analyzes this at the end when she explains how charity is something that is often stigmatized. It's something that's associated with being lazy, being a leech on the state, being a welfare queen, and narratives like this. Religious propaganda exists as well, which demonizes secularism, so people have a worse view of what these religious organizations ultimately look like. What we do on our side house is we uniquely get more countries letting in religious charities. That is insofar as certain charities have religious governments in power that are otherwise hesitant to let in charities. Charities need regulation to be let in and can't have regulatory interference where the actions are being secretly harmed. We think what this allows you to do uniquely is get buy-in to charities for these people. You get way more donations going to nations like Bhutan that would otherwise close themselves off. Some people who are moderate religious might use secular charities, but not everyone. But for some people who need religion in order to access these services, this is a critical impact in this debate because you get significantly more access in the developing world for vast donations. But also note that at the point at which you get more religious donations, you also get this scrutiny and a direct challenge of legitimacy on religions as something that's superior inherently by agreeing there's another one. You get competing religious organizations going into these states. You get the negotiation and dialogue between various religious leaders. The reason why Bhutan lets in Buddhist charities as well, and you allow individuals in Bhutan to get a good conception of what Buddhism is, even though it's a majority Muslim state, is precisely because of these donations and giving that they do when they would expunge and block out secular charities. You get more scrutiny on our side of the house. Very clearly won this debate from opening off.
member of opposition to proceed with the up case. Yeah.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes.
Great. All right, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I'll talk about two things. Number one, why it has to be religious giving and why it is important that we have religious donation, even assuming you have an equal amount of donations on both sides. Because I'd want to note the contribution from opening opposition is number one, on nuance insofar as there are many compelling mechanisms as well, or state mechanisms to ensure that there is a sufficient amount of giving. In fact, even in the worst case that you had the tax religions, etc., which could have been forced because of the different justifications that come out from closing government, I'd argue we'd still prefer that religions are the ones giving out this kind of money. But secondly, I'd like to note that they had to defend the counterfactual of why states, secular organizations, were any better at being able to provide these kinds of religious goods. I will take on the burden that closing government pushes. Let's say they spend it on church upkeep. Let's say they spend it on all the different things that do not directly go to the poor. I would say that is incredibly important. What is the nuance of religious giving? Because while opening half teams just talk about the quantity of money, I would argue that more than being able to get out of economic desperation, the nature of poverty is not just a lack of money. It is a lack of spiritual fulfillment and a lack of ability to access meaning and agency because of the different circumstances that life has thrown at you. I.e., it is when you have difficulty being able to do what you want and live a work that you like because you have to work either a job that does not give you enough money to do what you want, or a job that is going to be incredibly punishing 9 to 5 because it's manual labor and your back is always going to be broken down by working in this kind of machine. But moreover, it is the need to make this a religious nature of giving, because a lot of the time, these people who live in these hard conditions feel like they have been left behind by God, that they are no longer care about. A lot of these people think they're being punished by God, that they are poor because they are criminals, that they are poor because they are sinners, and therefore God no longer cares about them, that they deserve whatever is coming their way. I would note that poverty is not only a painful experience physically, but often an incredibly mentally and spiritually damaging one that is incredibly isolating. Why is this important? And I'll directly engage with closing government. The first thing I want to note is that even if this was short-termist in nature or does not solve structural inequality, I'd like to note that the counterfactual is unlikely to do the same. Firstly, a lot of secular charities are also very short-termist in nature because you need proof of concept to be able to get more donors. So even if it takes 10 years to build a very good infrastructure plan to be able to uplift people out of poverty, that's not likely to get people to donate because they do not see it until that 10-year mark and therefore are just not likely to donate to begin with, and therefore they'll prioritize short-term nature of it. Secondly, governments are often lobbied quite strongly by the wealthy, are most likely to spend their tax money in capital cities, in areas that are most productive, in subsidizing big business because they're the most powerful and seen as good for the state, and therefore are much less likely to give them to the same poor individuals they talk about. So, unless they meaningfully change structural inequality on gov, this is not the tipping point of this debate. What is? Even if it is true that you spend on things like church upkeep, more than being able to sustain yourself on a day-to-day basis, I would argue that things like finding meaning in life through things like church and the communities that it is able to provide, as conceded by closing government, are very important for you to feel like there is purpose to your life because there are other people around you that care about you. The feeling that you are directly in contact and in close communication with your God because there are people being sent out on missions, and obviously that takes a significant amount of money. Or if ever you receive any of this money directly, that you are being personally and influenced, like the people around you are being influenced by God to act on his behalf and therefore are able to guide you. Because note, this personal relationship with God is sometimes the only source of comfort and solace in a world that is incredibly damaging to your psyche, because you feel like you haven't been left behind, because you feel like there is possibly a better tomorrow because God will be able to bring you there and provide you with that. It is this belief and conception of a God that gets people on a day-to-day basis, because we cannot rely on the fact that there is enough political will to solve the incredibly difficult material and structural realities of the poor, but we can rely on the fact that these spiritual necessities of the poor that are often just as important as the economic perceptions that people have about their own lives are incredibly important to be able to live on a day-to-day basis. And note especially that in areas where this is most likely to happen are areas that are probably quite religious, and therefore they likely prioritize these things. They're likely to be quite swayed by these things and therefore are more likely to find value and meaning in their lives as a consequence. Secondly, I want to talk about social attitudes, because this will determine, therefore, how do we feel about the poor? Why is it an important doctrine to integrate within religion and, as a consequence, direct political will one way or another? And this is important because I want to note the paradox of religion. You have a God that is all-powerful, omnipotent, all-knowing, but also for some reason you have people who are suffering, people who are dying and starving. How do you make sense of that as a religion? There are two ways. The first is to say that God will use that action, and that's what's likely happening on our side. And that engages with the nuance and opening government, because you can't believe it. It was just something that people personally decided themselves to do, rather than one God had divinely commanded upon all people as an obligation, because God is willing to act and use humans as his hands. I would like to note that this is important, because what this says is that we have an obligation to the poor, and that God uses his power to be able to inspire us to use and fulfill that obligation in order to do that as a consequence. I first want to rebut OG here and say that there are many things that have a good utilitarian benefit that are probably coercive but are still good, i.e. the same taxes Gov seems to want to defend, i.e. laws that prevent you from being able to access agency. Insofar as the poor are the least likely to be commanded into this and the most likely to benefit, I'd argue that's okay. But I'd want to note, therefore, that this creates a social norm, especially when religions and states have historically been intertwined, not only today but in the past, and have often been the basis for multiple social values moving on. I'll explain why the lack of a counterfactual on Gov is punishing, because that likely counterfactual is damaging, but I'll first take opening government.
Don't they provide better religious services when they can't just oblige followers to give money, but when they have to show their worth? And how do poor people gain fulfillment when they feel they failed their obligation and displeased God?
So if you say that it's just going to be whatever excess, it's not clear why any of that goes to religions to begin with, and therefore you don't access any of your harm. Secondly, what is the likely counterfactual? If you have an all-powerful God and people who continue to die and suffer and stay in poverty, what other religions do is to justify that kind of suffering. For example, in Indonesia, when tsunamis and natural disasters hit irreligious areas, they say that God is cleansing sinners, God is cleansing heretics. And in fact, there's many popular reasons to support that today. I don't personally believe it, obviously, but there are many people who think that areas are poor because they're filled with criminals and they deserve it. That's why we should take away tax money from that. This is the only way to potentially justify an all-powerful God and at the same time a significant amount of human suffering, because if God is unwilling to act on their behalf, it is therefore God choosing to divinely punish them as a consequence of their caste, as a consequence of being sinners, as a consequence of being bad people. And note that this is important because any kind of social direction, i.e. what policies you vote for, are determined by these religious and social attitudes to begin with. So rather than redistribution, which I'd argue is also inspired by our side of the house, you're less likely to get donations, because if people think people deserve the punishment and suffering that they go through, the answers to poor people are instead things like mass incarceration, over-policing, and punitive measures to be able to emphasize that they deserve the kind of life they live, rather than wanting to redistribute wealth, which is the important doctrine of Zakat and many other pillars of religion. I'm very proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the member of opposition for that speech. We welcome the government whip to conclude the CG case. Here.
Please cue on by turning your cameras and waving. I will take OO at some point, or CO. I don't really mind. And please don't message anything in the chat because it distracts me. First, on the CO case about spirituality, 3 responses. The first is, I will bite the bullet and say that spiritual needs are less important than physical basic economic needs. The reason for this is because physical needs often shape your spiritual mindset, i.e. studies show that if you're sleep deprived, you're much more likely to be passively suicidal, Don't ask me why I know that. And also, it's just economically, it's just like, yeah. But the second main reason for this is because even if spiritual needs matter, it's unclear why this is the best way to fulfill them. 3 responses. The first is, I think what Enting tells you about how oftentimes this fades into the background because it becomes obligation, becomes everything is doing, and you don't think about why you're doing this because it's expected of you, means you don't derive any joy from this. The comparative is when you think about consciously what you want to put your money towards. And I think in these circumstances, when you're choosing to give to God as an act of love and devotion, that makes you much, much happier and gives you better self-esteem. But the third response I would give to this is I just think it's really non-unique that giving is a way to experience religious fulfillment and meaning. The way in which the vast majority of people find religion meaningful is the people around you, i.e. the sharing and a feeling of communal good and protection and loving God. So I think for these reasons, I think giving is very unimportant. But the third thing is, even at their very, very best case scenario, I think this is just likely to be true that if poor people live in this constant state of suffering, if they don't give, this is a huge reason why they are coerced into this disproportionately. And that's important, first of all, because that suggests that the amount they suffer as a result of this more than they benefit from it. Because note that in order for these poor Christians to benefit from this, they must, like the amount of charity they must be receiving must outweigh 10% of their income, which is highly unlikely given the Enting's analysis about how mostly goes to charity, but mostly goes to churches, but 2, because I just also think it's the case that a lot of this is wasted in bureaucracy, right? I.e. I give the money. Some of it goes to pay the church, pay the person collecting it. Other money goes towards paying for capital. Like all of these other middle steps means that it's often a very, very small amount of money and people end up suffering much, much more. Okay, so having taken out CO, I'm gonna now move on to the main issue in this debate, i.e. about the well-being of people who are very, very poor in terms of economic sense. What OG gives us is that, well, you lose money if you're poor, but also you suffer because of the obligation and the feeling of stress. So the first thing I would just offer is that I think that the problem with this is that I don't think that they do the legwork to explain why it's the case that what Ob said about like mitigating factors doesn't exist, but also because I think that the thing about stress probably is just outweighed by the fact that we all kind of agree that basic needs are more important. The core of this debate then is which side gets more direct utility to those who are suffering the most. O gives you 2 main claims. The first is that, well, you have more money from this, right? There's a subset of people who wouldn't previously donate who now would, and also an idea about how it's qualitatively better, i.e. it becomes more consistent, right? Maybe I'll take you later. The problem with this is that there's a very, very big leap between what they say people give and the outcome they're trying to prove, i.e. that millions of people who otherwise would be starving and suffering are now fed. Let's talk about what this realistically boils down to. The first thing is I think Enting is the first person to actually do the charitable wing and explain to you why the net increase in funding is likely to be very, very small. The reason for this is because she examines why people actually pay teeth and explain why those who are motivated by teeth are disproportionately likely to be those who are poor for a couple of reasons. The first is, even if theoretically it says that you only have to give 2 or 10% of your income, realistically people still look at each other, i.e. even if I'm much, much poorer and I can only pay 5 pennies into the basket, I see my neighbor who I know and respect putting 5 shillings in, I feel inferior and I'm like I'm not properly giving what I should to God, especially because the motivation of these church pastors is to say, look, all of this is directly giving towards good. It's not about the act of giving, it's also about utility, which is also something the op needs to buy if they want to prove that there's positive outcomes. But second of all, it's also because of prestige, right? The reason why rich people are able to dodge taxes, even though everyone accepts that it's really, really more important, is because they're more respected. People think that they earned the money and therefore they should be able to keep it. For these reasons, it's also the case that rich people often dodge their teeth obligations as well, and those who are motivated by teeth by the most are likely to be very, very poor. The second main reason we beat this is because we win in terms of where this money goes to. So what we get from POI from OO is that, well, oftentimes church leaders are still held accountable by their own beliefs, right? I still generally want to do good. The problem here is that it's not a question of whether there's some accountability. We agree that this is probably true. It's a question of comparative and whether or not there will be more accountability on our side. And I think that's definitely true, right? Religious accountability is very, very low because of religious hierarchies, i.e. if I do something that's fucked up, I say this is the will of God. Secular accountability is not fantastic, but it's much, much better because with a deity, you have no tangible way of holding someone accountable, but moreover, because secular charities are much more explicitly about delivering benefits, which means that oftentimes you're transparent about tax releases, about what exactly you're doing, where you're comparatively more efficient than other other organizations, whereas religious charities often benefit from being the only church in the region having a captive audience. For example, for these reasons, I think that it's true the majority of money on their side goes towards pointless service of churches. I'll take OO.
The complacency argument doesn't work because if your frame is true that religion sets that charity is good under either side of the house, people who would go above and beyond would still have an incentive to. The comparative is we just get more donations in the first place for people who would otherwise not give.
The problem here is that the framing of why people give is off, right? I don't think that people who give tithes right now see it as going above and beyond. I think everyone sees it as discharging an obligation towards God. And the reason for this is because that's the way it's framed when you're speaking to people. On the other hand, when you frame giving not in terms of religious duty, but rather in terms of fulfilling your natural urges to be empathetic and care about other people, understand that you're in a position of privilege, that makes you much, much more self-conscious about the privileges you experience, and you feel the desire to go above and beyond in a way that you don't if it's purely a question of obligation. But second of all, let's think about what this subset of people actually is, right? Because God really relies on this idea about how there's a subset of people who otherwise wouldn't donate, who would now donate. I would posit that this is also true on the op side, but the difference is that the people who are affected by the teeth narrative are likely to be much, much lower income than people who are sensitive to alternative narratives such as independent of religious organization, we have a need to, we should do good for other people. Why do these two narratives and motivations for giving actually trade off? The reason for this is twofold. The first is it just takes up space, right? i.e., if the people around you are always doing one thing, you yourself copy it. And I think that the intuition for why this is true is there are patterns of giving that are very, very similar in different states of America. But the second main reason is also because of prominence, i.e., if you perceive your church as being the main actor doing things, you don't look at and see for other alternatives. I think for those reasons, we create vast amounts of good. We actually create the potential for long-term structural change. Very happy to propose.
All right, we thank the government whip for that speech. We welcome the opposition whip to conclude the CEO case. Here, and the debate.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take POIs in the chat. Yes. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two things in this speech. First, the argument that they don't respond to, and then secondly, the argument they do a bad job of responding to. Miko has an entire half of his speech explaining why attitudes towards the poor without this obligation will shift towards a far worse counterfactual. The reason why this argument is analytically important to GovBench is because notice, GovBench's benefits rely on an alternative of stewardship arising absent this narrative. But because they can't fiat this narrative arising, they have to prove the transition to it absent the obligation existing. And as we've already illustrated, it is clear this halfway point is unlikely, that there's a limited bandwidth for complex narratives, that the lack of a hard obligation pushes people towards the natural alternative of not giving at all. And what we pointed out is that the likely development will be, especially given the predominant perception surrounding the obligations we have towards the poor, towards God's role and towards the poor, it will be that the poor people deserve to be in such bad situations. Broadly speaking, influencing not just how people generally donate in churches, but also how people generally do things towards the poor in terms of the government, in terms of social policy, and in terms of individual interactions. Why was this argument important? First of all, it immediately outweighs opening opposition's argument quite neatly, because if you believe OO's arguments are true, then the harm felt on Gov is just you're missing out on some additional money. What we're saying is that the loss of this obligation presents a clear and pressing harm towards any social action we could take to materially uplift the conditions of those who are in most poor and most disprivileged areas, whom are most likely to be ignored by the state. What this literally implies is that the narratives and the goals that they want in their second point in closing government are least likely to arise without the existence of this obligation to normalize giving to the poor, to entrench the belief that giving to the poor is an obligation felt by everyone, especially since historically, as states developed, it was the belief in the first place that we should religiously redistribute in the first place that eventually became secularized throughout states. So an important implication of Mika's argument that since it gets unresponded to, gives us not only the solvency that they seek out for, maybe there is some complacency, but a level of complacency is better than having no incentive to donate at all, or perhaps even worse incentives to trample over the poor's rights economically. We also pointed out that religions were in power far before the nation state we know now, and that the weakening of the priority over private property and the belief that you have an obligation obligation towards the poor arose first from this obligation religiously before states ever had this in the first place, which is why this is a prerequisite to many of their benefits. So already from the first 2 minutes 30 of the speech, it's quite clearly illustrated that if government bench is winning, if you believe closing government is kicking top half's ass, we're kicking their ass, which is why we win analytically over everyone else in the round. However, the second thing in this debate is the part where everyone else engages. So we have a separate dimension to win the debate. But let's for safety engage with the rest of it, even if I don't feel the need to. What makes the poor truly happy? You know what? They do have good responses to us. Why are these responses still wrong? First, their first response is to say spiritual mindsets are shaped by physical mindsets, to which Miko has a good rebuttal here, questioning the likelihood that the state alternatives they have will be good given their counterfactual, where we said secular charity needs immediate results, which is why it's likely to be short-termist. Governments are likely to be lobbied to spend their money in non-productive areas and the subsidy of big business. Governments have an incentive not to help you so much because of the fact that the poorer you are, the more dependent you are on the state. And moreover, it is the poor who are least likely to have deciding power in states' incentives because they are least economically populous and least economically substantial. What this simply means is that perhaps it might be the case that sometimes physical mindsets are better than spiritual mindsets, but it's not clear why they'd have that physical upliftment in the first place. But the second thing is actually it's the other way around, right? Your physical conditions are what perhaps maybe preconditions in some instances, but realistically speaking, you don't live to eat, you live to find meaning, you live to be happy, you live to find meaning in your work or your job or your community. They're just saying giving doesn't do much for you, which might be a response to opening opposition, but this misunderstands our claim. Our claim is not giving makes you happy. Our response is that the church infrastructure you invest in, the opportunity to go through school through church education, the inculcation of church values, and the setup of a support system that they say this money goes to is likely to be good for people. That is to say, the presence of a support system through the construction of churches in the first place is good. That someone can spiritually console you when you can no longer find solace in your physical reality. These are the things you get access to because, as closing government says, you start investing your money in these things. So realistically speaking, it is these beliefs that make you most happy overall. It is the belief that there is meaning to your life that actually provides context and shaping towards the actual physical contexts you have in your life. So they say maybe there's some marginal increase in food, but the actual goal of this increase in food is to make people happier, is to make people have higher outcomes of contentedness and satisfaction. And as we said, the most direct connection to this is the feeling that you have a place in the world, is the feeling that you weren't abandoned by God, and is the feeling by and large that you have somebody to look out for you. These things are the only things that closing opposition guarantees that no one else guarantees in this debate. Lastly then, I also want to point out that by and large, this argument quite neatly deals with everyone else in the round. First of all, because we also neatly point out that many of these things, again, if did not happen in the counterfactual, would turn to worse alternatives that would deprive the poor of other quite important things. Actually, I'll take a PY now from opening government. Go.
Jesus was literally a poor socialist that said, feed the homeless. We have religious empathy to get our narrative. On religious fulfillment, though, you get more choice for how people access fulfillment on our side because you tell them one of those ways of fulfillment must be payment.
Yes, we know that now because the narrative exists and the obligation exists on our side. You can't use present day examples to prove your side that is imagining an entirely new world. Beyond that, we said perhaps the even said perception of Jesus was that he was born to be and destined to be in quite good conditions. And the fact that he succeeded so well is evidence that he deserved to succeed, while the people that didn't succeed, the people that spit on him, deserve to be poor. So realistically speaking, that POI not only does nothing, it actually makes our case substantially stronger. Okay, finally, capping off this debate, because we've also won the point where, people are just happy, where we've uplifted welfare more, because we identified the closest link across that cleaves across happiness for individuals, which is say whether or not people are actually themselves happy. Finally, then, I also want to point out that they also misunderstand the actual goal of the debate by and large, which is, again, top half is saying it's important to give some amount of money. I think there's some point saying that the money will not be used well. The first point on this is, realistically speaking, if there is some soft obligation to do something with it, and there's just some expectation to give out of your own free will, then by virtue of the fact that since there's not as strongly set up as an obligation, the fact that the church doesn't have it as an obligation to manage the money as well, since you're giving it out of your own free will as opposed to an obligation, it seems to me like intuitively, opening government's concerns about where you are more likely to reform the church and have more stringent accountability mechanisms happens in closing opposition, where the obligation sets up the bureaucracy for it to exist in the first place, and by virtue of the fact that there's more money to actually manage these things in the first place. Finally, how should you view this debate absent anything? If you view this debate about where we uplift people's lives the most, then you should clearly view it from closing opposition's perspective, because we identify, independent of where we get more money, the money is used better. Secondly, the money is used in ways that tangibly improves people's lives more. And thirdly, if you don't believe any of that, that any counterfactual that Gov wants to push relies on closing opposition's historical analysis to run the round. For these reasons, negate.
Yeah, thank you everyone for what was a very interesting round. Cross house, shake hands, wave at one another. It's still friendly despite it being a tournament. And I guess you'll head to the main room and we'll call you back in about 15 to 20 minutes after we're done with the deliberation. Other than that, thank you so much.